Back on September 4th, 1964, Donald Shrum and two of his friends decided to take a weekend to go bull hunting down in Tahoe National Forest near the town of Cisco Grove. They would make a campsite and then each go their separate ways, all looking for deer. After losing track of his friends, Donald would decide to spend the night in a tree, safely away from predators. After just a couple of hours of rest, a strange light zigzagging through the tops of the trees would grab his attention. Shortly after this, he would observe two humanoids in metallic suits walking and examining plant life in the nearby area. Thinking that he had gone unnoticed, Donald would watch this bizarre event for several minutes before the two entities were joined by a third figure, which to him appeared to be some kind of robot. The three creatures would then approach the tree and then start shaking it in an attempt to dislodge him. When this didn't work, the robot would open up its mouth, releasing a cloud of gas that rendered Donald unconscious. He would then be awoken by the two humanoid aliens climbing the tree trying to get him. He would retaliate, but the robot would once again come back and spray this vapor up at him, knocking him out for a second time. And these events would repeat themselves and go on for the next 12 hours as Donald fought for his life while falling in and out of consciousness. Donald Shrum was 26 at the time and was married to his wife Judy. He was a welder for the Aerojet Missile Corporation of Sacramento and would work on several well-known projects. Shrum mostly worked on the Titan missiles, being responsible for welding the thrust chambers together, but he would also work on Polaris missiles as well. He even would work on a few boosters for some of NASA's rockets. At one point, Donald and one of his co-workers would even receive an award from their employer, Aerojet. This was for their flawless welding work on the booster for America's first satellite, Telstar. One of Donald's friends, Vincent Alvarez, a missile painter, had been working alongside him for over 5 years. One day the two got to talking and decided to put together a little weekend deer hunting trip. They would also invite a third man, Tim Trueblood, who also worked in the same factory as them. Donald, who was on day shift, didn't know Tim that well since he worked nights, but Alvarez knew them both pretty well because he was working on the rotating swing shift. But this was alright with everyone because all three of the men were avid hunters and very experienced outdoorsmen. On September 4th, 1964, they would all leave early in the day, driving around 70 miles down Old Route 40. They would end up not too far away from the town of Cisco Grove in Placer County, California. This area of Tahoe National Forest was called Loch Levin Lakes. At this time of year, deer hunting with a gun was illegal, meaning that if they wanted to hunt, they would have to use their bows. This wasn't a huge deal, as Donald actually preferred the bow. He'd been hunting this way for around 10 years, and he later added, "I actually had better luck with the bow than I did with the gun." After parking their car, the group set out into the forest with their backpacks full of equipment and supplies and their bows and arrows in hand. About 1.5 miles into their walk, they would spot a rattlesnake in their path, shooting and killing it with an arrow. Little did any of them know, this would be the only kill they would be making that weekend. Once 3 miles south of Route 40, they would decide to put up their camp near one of the 3 small lakes. Shrum would later say that the whole group was happy to have time off work, be in the outdoors, and they were all together in a pretty cheerful mood. Once everything at camp was set up, they made their plans. They would spread out to look for deer while trying to keep each other within shouting distance. There'd been news of wild animal attacks in the area lately, so they all agreed that if it got too dark, they would spend the night in the woods and find camp in the morning. This is when the three would set out into the deep woods, spreading out but also trying to keep each other within sight. Donald would explain the paths they took, saying, "We were getting ready for the evening hunt, and I went down one ridge, one friend of mine went down the canyon bottom, and the other went down the other ridge." After a bit of hiking, Donald realized that the ridge he was following led to a steep drop that he wasn't able to climb down. He knew to regroup with the others, he would have to retrace his steps and then go around the other side of this ridge. Shrum would comment on this, saying, "By the time I got to the bottom, it was pitch black. I got down in this real brushy country. I really got tangled up, and so I stumbled through the brush. I couldn't see anything. It was just dark. You know, before the moon comes up, it's just really dark in the mountains." With it already too difficult to get around, he decided he would stick to the plan and just find his way back to camp in the morning. Now lost and separated from the others, he didn't want to take his chances with the unfamiliar terrain covered in brush, so he hiked back up the ridge in search of a safe place to sleep. After a bit of walking, he would decide to get up somewhere high, saying, "I could see the moon was starting up, and I could see a big granite cliff with a crack that went up the side, and the crack was about a foot wide. so I was able to walk up there, and there was a tree right at the edge when I got up there. I figured there's a lot of bear in the area, so I figured I would spend the night in the tree. The base of the tree to the first limb was about 12 feet, but from the rock it was only about 7 feet. I could reach up and hand walk out to the trunk of the tree and then pull myself up. Once up in the rough branches, he tried to make himself as comfortable as possible. He had actually brought a long military-style belt with him just for this type of scenario, using it to strap himself to the tree. After hearing of the animal attacks, he thought this would be a much better option than sleeping alone on the ground completely defenseless. At this point, it was only about 7 p.m., but he settled down and attempted to get some rest. However, just 2 hours later, a bright white light zigzagging through the trees would grab his attention. At first, Donald thought that this was just a flashlight or maybe a lantern, but then he also noticed it bobbing up and down. This light was moving east to west and seemed to oscillate up and down as it traveled, but soon he could tell that it was farther away than he originally thought, as he could see it disappear over the horizon before reappearing. Donald later said, "I thought my friends had gotten a helicopter from the Forest Service, and I figured they were coming out looking for me." Even with their plans discussed earlier, he still thought that maybe Alvarez and Trueblood had gotten worried and ended up reporting him missing. He then jumped down from the tree and quickly lit 3 small fires with some matches. He then waved his arms and shouted towards the light, trying to get its attention. This seemed to work too, because it soon turned and started heading in his direction.
So I was really relieved then, because I thought it was a helicopter still, until it got within, maybe 60 feet or yards. I'm not sure the distance at night, but it just hovered there with no sound. So then I panicked because I knew it was no helicopter. I thought it was something from outer space, but it looked like all I could see is about an 8-inch glow. So I thought it was just a little tiny flying saucer. And then I kind of panicked, and I threw my bow up in the tree again and hand walked out there, that limb, and got up in the tree. And I had all camouflage clothing on, so I figured, well, they won't see me here, But then this light went a half circle around me over the canyon. Then I could see the shadow of the whole spacecraft.
This is when he would realize that this was different from anything he had ever seen before. When the small ball of light flew in a 45-degree arc around him, he was able to see it from the other side, seeing that it was actually a huge cylindrical flying object. It looked to be almost 150 feet long, with 3 strange glowing rectangular panels on each side, and the front of this craft looked to have some kind of searchlight emanating from it. It then came to a complete stop, opened up the panels on the side, and out of the middle opening, another light would emerge. It looked to be a smaller craft, and then flew over and landed on a nearby ridge. Donald would later describe the scene, saying to him it looked like the large craft was the mothership, while the smaller looked to be a scout ship. The scout ship was a saucer shape with a large dome on the upper section, and on the very top sat a very bright light. Several minutes later, Shrum would hear footsteps and brush shuffling from the direction of the landed craft. The sounds were getting louder, and he soon realized that they were coming straight towards him. 2 humanoid figures would then step out of the bushes in front of him. They appeared to only be 4 or 5 feet tall and had fairly large and dark eyes. To him, they looked to be wearing silver spacesuits that also went over their heads and obscured their faces. While walking in his direction, the 2 humanoids seemed to be breaking off bits of different plants and examining them. Once they reached the bottom of the tree, the 2 silver-suited men stopped and looked straight up at him. This is when Donald thought that maybe he wasn't so hidden, and they had actually been coming after him this whole time. This is when a 3rd figure would step out of the brush, walking around and putting out the small fires he had lit just a little while before. This one was a metallic silver-gray color and much bulkier than the previous 2. Donald would get the impression that it was some kind of robot, but he wasn't completely sure. He would later say that they were all around the same size, and it could have just been another humanoid in an even stranger suit. This robot creature's jaw also looked to be on hinges, and its eyes flickered red and orange, reminding him of fire. The robot entity then joined the 2 humanoids at the base of the tree, and again looked straight up at Donald. Then it reached up and touched part of its face, with its mouth then falling open. A large puff of white smoke or vapor then shot out, being launched right at Shrum, who was still trying to hide in the tree. The smoke rose and formed a small cloud, which completely enveloped him as it almost immediately rendered him unconscious. After what to him only felt like a few minutes, he would come back to, and although he was a bit nauseous, he felt that he was all around alright. But then looking down, he was terrified to see that the three creatures were still below him. Unsure of what to do, Donald started to throw lit matches down at them. This caused the humanoids and robot to back away for a few moments, but they soon came right back to the tree. Managing to load an arrow into his bow, he took aim at the three creatures, firing right at the robot. This made a direct hit in his chest, and it was said to have caused sparks to fly while also slightly knocking it backwards. The two humanoids made a dash for the bushes and then disappeared from view, possibly hiding from the arrow fire. Shrum would then shoot 2 more arrows at the robot, with them also bouncing off in a flurry of sparks. The robot then took a few steps back, looked right up at him, and again released another cloud of knockout gas. When he woke back up, all 3 of the creatures were back at the base of the tree. This time he had a different idea. At that time, it was popular for men to style their hair with grease, and Donald would do this daily. This meant that the cap that he was wearing had absorbed a lot of this grease, and it made it highly flammable. He then lit the hat on fire and threw it right at the 3 creatures. This is when he would look over and notice that the mothership was still hovering there, possibly this whole time. As the 3 entities backed away from the flaming cap, the mothership suddenly took off. It flew away at such an incredible speed that it was out of sight within 1 second. The robot would then puff out another cloud of smoke, once again knocking him unconscious. A little while later, when he came to, he would see the 2 humanoids attempting to climb the tree. In an attempt to scare him off, he used his matches to light some dry branches and pine cones on fire, throwing them down at the 2 climbers. Donald then shook the tree until the 2 entities hopped off of it. The 2 humanoids backed away, but the robot came closer, spewing more white smoke up at him. Donald again passed out, but he never felt like he was out that long. As he woke up this time, he would again see the 2 entities climbing up the tree, but they hadn't made it very far up. Now all out of pine cones, he took off his shirt and started to rip it up. He would light these shirt pieces on fire, letting them fall down onto the 2 creatures. The previous events would repeat themselves, and he again was enveloped by a knockout gas. He woke up and immediately looked down at the base of the tree, but they didn't seem to be climbing after him this time. The 3 had backed up a little ways, but they were still staring right at him. He then wrapped up his compass and the remaining bits of his shirt and set it ablaze. He threw it into some nearby bushes, thinking that maybe he could start a fire and attract some attention, hoping he could get some help this way. With only his jeans and undershirt, he was basically out of things to burn at this point, and unsure of what else to do, Shrum started to throw his pocket change at them. But none of this seemed to work, as the humanoids quickly put out the fire and gathered up each coin. This is when a second robot creature would walk out of the woods. It approached the first spot, stopped right in front of it, and stood face to face with him. This is when Donald claims to have seen some kind of energy transfer between the 2 robots. After a moment, the 2 turned and looked right at him, letting out an even larger cloud of smoke than before. And this seemed to knock him out for more than just a few minutes this time. As he opened his eyes, he could see the first rays of sun coming from over the horizon. He was also quite startled to find himself practically dangling by his belt. Donald felt that wrapping himself to the tree with the belt was the only thing that kept him from falling that night. Quite dazed, but altogether unhurt, he would make his way down the tree, noticing that it must have been at least 12 hours since he first climbed up. Shrum then set out in search of the campsite that he and his friends had put up together the day before. Now bright enough out to tell where he was walking, he quickly found his way and made it back all on his own. There he found his 2 friends waiting on him, and although they hadn't called in a helicopter, they were still a little concerned. After sitting down and talking for a bit, Donald would find out that he wasn't the only one to see something the night before. Back when Donald was first climbing the tree, True Blood would return to camp and find out that he was the only one that had made it back. After waiting around for some time, it had become completely dark. It's then that Tim decided to grab his flashlight and go out searching for the other 2 men. Then, right as Tim was leaving, Alvarez, who was still trying to make his way back, would see a bright light streak across the sky. The light then started to glow and come lower down. It flew over the trees for a moment before suddenly shooting back up into the sky. While standing there and watching this spectacle, Vincent came to notice the beams of light coming from True Blood's flashlight. Following the light, Vincent soon found his way over to Tim. They both figured that with how experienced Donald was in hunting and hiking, he would most likely be safe until morning. That's when the two decided to make their way back to camp and settle down for the night. Then Shrum would tell them both his own story, believing that Alvarez had seen the same mothership. His two friends would believe his claims, and they would all decide to go back out to the location and search for any physical evidence. They wouldn't find a whole lot, but they did come across the burned pine cones and a few shirt fragments, as well as 2 of the arrows. However, they did find it interesting that they couldn't find the compass or any of the coins. After this, they returned to camp, where they would pack everything back up. The 3 would drive back home, all agreeing not to go to the authorities. Since they all worked at Aerojet, they were concerned a story like this may hurt their reputations or even cost them their jobs. For a little while, nothing much would happen, that is until Donald made the mistake of letting his mother-in-law hear his story of the encounter. She quickly called an astronomer friend of hers who worked at the local college, telling them all of the details. This astronomer would then immediately contact the nearby McClellan Air Force Base, telling them the whole story as well as Donald's name and even his address. Oddly enough, instead of going out to his house, they would call him up and ask Donald to meet in an empty house at a, quote, off-base housing development. Shrum would agree to this, going out there to meet with 2 officers. He told them his account and showed them the arrows that he had shot at the robot. Donald even claims that metal shavings were visible on these arrowheads, and after showing the officers, they quickly confiscated them. They would then try to insist that none of what Donald had seen had actually happened, or at least not the way he thinks it did. They even seemed to give him multiple different scenarios, as if giving him the option to choose one. At one point, they even suggested that this was all just Boy Scouts playing a prank on him. Shrum would eventually go along with this to some degree, and at the very least agreed that he wasn't certain of what he had seen. He would later comment that he only said this mostly to avoid repercussions at his workplace. This seemed to be good enough for the airbase officers, and the attention Donald was receiving soon died back down. Later that year, Shrum went back out to the site and even claims that he ended up finding the 3rd arrow. Also, he and his 2 friends would continue working together for the next 2 years until Aerojet eventually laid them all off. After this, they would slowly lose contact with True Blood, but Donald and Vincent would still occasionally talk with each other for many years. At one point, Alvarez even wrote an affidavit for Shrum, stating that he believed he saw the same mothership that night. Vincent would write, "I have worked with Don for 5 or 6 years, and knowing him for that length of time, I have no reason to doubt or question his integrity." Tim Trueblood has never come out to speak about this encounter, but unlike the other 2, he never claimed to have seen anything to begin with. He is now believed to be living in Hawaii, but has refused interviews and chosen to remain silent. About 40 years after the whole event, Donald Trump would finally retire. Now, without the fear of losing his job or hurting his reputation, he was free to tell his story. This is when he agreed to give researchers and authorities permission to use his name for the first time in decades. Soon, several books would be written about his encounter, making the story much more well-known not just in the US, but around the world as well. These books also look into the location of this incident and present several interesting theories of their own. Placer County, formed in 1851, was a historic region of California known as the Gold County. This is an area where thousands of miners from around the world would flock to, all hoping to make themselves rich. The gold in the area was all mixed into the gravel deposits, and to get to it, all one would have to do was sift the sand and rocks. This county also had deposits of uranium as well as other minerals. And this is interesting to many ufologists because UFO sightings have occurred near such deposits many times all around the world. Other researchers have also pointed out the diversity of animals and plants in the Tahoe National Forest. They speculate that when the 2 humanoids were originally walking around breaking off bits of plants, they were actually surveying the flora and fauna in the area. Some researchers have also compared this case to a couple of other well-known extraterrestrial encounters, as well as a few other just weird incidents taking place around the world in the same time period. One similar incident would happen back in 1947 over in Italy when a man named R. Johannes was painting near a remote mountain stream. Suddenly, he would see a bright red lens-shaped object around 30 feet in diameter fly over and land nearby. It's then that he claimed to have seen, quote, 2 odd-looking dwarves with large heads standing next to this strange object. He called out to them, but as soon as they noticed him, one would touch his belt, which then emitted a beam of vapor right at Johannes. He would feel something like an electric shock before falling onto the ground paralyzed. However, in this case, he was still conscious, and he watched as the two dwarves quickly gathered up his painting, hopped back in their ship, and took off. Another event would take place in 1952, when a scoutmaster named Sonny de Vergers was camping in the woods with a group of scouts. They would all see a light in the woods, and upon investigation, they would come across a craft unlike any they had ever seen before. On top sat something that looked to be a turret with, quote, a horrible-looking being inside. The turret barrel then shot out a large ball of, quote, red fire, which formed a cloud that spread out around them and soon knocked the whole group unconscious. Oftentimes, the Cisco Grove encounter is also related to other cases that aren't quite as otherworldly. There was one strange man seen on and off through the 1800s up until the 1940s named Spring-Heeled Jack. He actually had similar knockout abilities and also dressed in a strange metallic suit, although his was either white or black and his helmet usually had horns or ears on top decorating it. People that ran into Spring-Heeled Jack were often assaulted with his claw-like hands before having either light plasma blue or white vapor shot into their faces, causing them to pass out. Although somewhat similar to Donald's encounter, many people nowadays believe this could have just been multiple different cases of people being knocked out by pranksters playing with chemicals. But with all of this said, what actually happened back at Cisco Grove? Although there was only one witness and no physical evidence, many find trouble poking holes in his story. And even when looking into his background, he just doesn't appear to have any reason to lie. He really didn't want all of this attention, and at the time he feared that it may hurt his career. He also didn't go to the authorities himself, only telling his story after a couple of officers got in contact with him. Researchers felt that there was just no point to Donald making up this whole series of events. If he was just a hoaxer, many wonder why he wouldn't get one of his friends to collaborate the whole event and not just part of it. This also doesn't seem to be a case of him falling for a prank, as the whole event just seems much too elaborate. But either way, Donald Shrum has stuck to his story for over 50 years, with his wife, friends, and many ufologists believing the story of his encounter. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Speaking of mineral deposits, I actually covered a case that happened right on top of one, the Falcon Lake incident. So just click this box here if that sounds like a good watch. Be sure to leave a comment too, I'm always interested to hear what you guys think about these topics. And again, this is actually still tier 3 of my alien abduction and incident iceberg, but I'm just slowly going over it so I can be sure to get all of the details in here. Oh, and before I go, I should also mention that this is now available in podcast format as well, so be sure to check it out if you like listening to these. And that's also available on most podcast platforms. For any of you that want to show your support, I also now have a Patreon and channel membership up. There you can also get videos early and ad-free. This was your host, Matt, and I want to believe